All right, today we are jumping headfirst into the economic arguments from the book, The Bitcoin Standard. Now, you might think this is all about Bitcoin, but to really get it, we first have to go on a wild ride through the entire history of money itself. We've got to unpack the fundamental problem that something like Bitcoin was even designed to solve. So let's get into it. So let's just start with a really provocative question, one that's right at the heart of this book's whole argument. We all tend to think of our money as, a stable thing. But what if the currency we use every single day is actually designed to lose its purchasing power over time? That's the core problem we're going to dig into. Okay, so to get a handle on this, we first have to agree on what money even is. At its most basic level, you don't eat money. You don't build a house with it. Its one and only essential job is to be a medium of exchange. It solves what economists call the coincidence of wants, right? In a barter world, if you have chickens and you want bread, you have to find a baker who just so happens to want your chickens. Money fixes that whole mess. Now, the book makes a really central distinction, and this is key to the entire argument. It basically says all forms of money fall into one of two camps. You've got hard money and you've got easy money. Hard money is something that's really difficult to make more of. Think of gold. Easy money, well, it's the opposite. You can create a ton of it, and you can do it pretty fast. And this one characteristic, how hard it is to make more, is what determines whether it holds its value or just bleeds it away over time. So how do we actually measure this hardness? The book gives us two really simple metrics to work with. First, you've got the stock. That's all the stuff that already exists. Think of it as the giant hoard of all the gold that's ever been mined in human history. Then you've got the flow. That's the brand new supply that gets produced, say, in a single year. Understanding this difference is absolutely crucial. And this brings us to what is arguably the most important metric in the entire book, the stock-to-flow ratio. It's simple. You just divide the total existing stock by the new annual flow. So if you have a really high ratio, it means that any new production is just a tiny, tiny drop in an enormous ocean of existing supply. And that, right there, is the mathematical definition of hard money. And this leads to what the author calls the easy money trap. It's this vicious cycle. Here's how it works. First, people decide to use something, let's say copper, to store their wealth. Demand goes up, so the price goes up. But because copper is pretty easy to mine, producers see this and they ramp up production like crazy to cash in. And what happens next? This huge flood of new copper hits the market, the price totally crashes, and everyone who is trying to save in copper gets completely wiped out. The book's point is that anything whose supply can be easily increased is doomed to fall into this trap. So with this whole idea of hard versus easy money in our heads, let's take a look at history. The book frames the entire story of money as this relentless, unavoidable competition, a race where different societies are always, consciously or not, searching for the hardest money they can find, the one that can best escape that easy money trap. This story is just a perfect example. On the Pacific island of Yap, they used these giant limestone wheels called rhinestones as money, and they were valuable because they were incredibly hard to quarry from another island and transport. Then, this American captain named David O'Keefe shows up in 1871 with modern tools and explosives. All of a sudden, he could quarry new stones with ease. But the island chief rejected them with this absolutely brilliant insight. The value wasn't in the stone itself, it was in the difficulty, the sheer effort of producing it. O'Keefe had created easy money, and they knew instinctively that it was worthless. And you see this exact same pattern repeat itself over and over again throughout history. The rhinestones failed once technology made them easy to make. Glass beads were a form of hard money in West Africa until European ships showed up and just flooded the market with cheap, mass-produced beads, basically draining the region's wealth. Same thing with seashells. They worked as money until modern boats could just dredge them up by the ton, causing massive inflation and destroying their monetary value. So after all this competition, why did gold ultimately win this race for hardness? Well, it really comes down to two simple chemical and geological facts. First, gold is practically indestructible. It doesn't rust, it doesn't corrode. That means almost all the gold ever mined in history is still with us today, creating an absolutely enormous existing stock. Second, it's incredibly difficult and expensive to get more of it out of the ground. So that new supply, the flow, is always a tiny, tiny fraction of the total stock, usually around 1.5% a year. This gives it the highest stock-to-flow ratio of any commodity, which, according to the book, made it the ultimate hard money. For thousands of years, the free market pretty much settled on gold. But then, in the 20th century, something completely new happened. We entered the age of government money, what we call fiat money. The book frames this not as some natural next step, but as a radical break from thousands of years of history, a major historical anomaly. And if you had to pinpoint where it all started, the book points to 1914. With the outbreak of World War I, governments had to figure out how to pay for this massive, unbelievably expensive war. Taxing people enough to cover it would have been political suicide. The much, much easier path was to just suspend the gold standard, break that link to a physically scarce asset, and just print the money they needed out of thin air. And this is what we call fiat money. Fiat is Latin for let it be done. It's money purely by government decree. Its value isn't backed by a scarce commodity, it's backed only by the authority of the government that issues it. And here's the critical part. Its supply is no longer constrained by the difficulty of mining something out of the ground, but only by the political decisions of a few people. And this chart right here, this shows you the result. The difference is just staggering. Gold's supply reliably chugs along, growing at about 1.5% per year. But major government currencies, according to the book's data, have averaged over 7% annual supply growth. And for currencies in developing nations, that number just explodes to over 32% a year. This is the very definition of moving from a hard money system to an easy money system. So, if 1914 was the beginning of the end for the gold standard, 1971 was the final nail in the coffin. That's when President Nixon went on television and officially announced that the US dollar would no longer be redeemable for gold, even by other countries' central banks. The very last formal link to a hard, physical asset was severed, and for the first time in history, the entire world was on a fully fiat monetary system. So after this whole journey through hard money, easy money, gold, and fiat, the book brings us to a really critical question. What actually makes money sound? What are the fundamental properties we should even be looking for in a good form of money? Well, according to the economic tradition that this book draws from, these are the key properties. Sound money is something that people choose freely in the market, not something that a government forces on them. It absolutely has to hold its value over long stretches of time, which, as we know, means it needs a high stock-to-flow ratio. And crucially, it has to be resistant to government control and confiscation, which is presented as being essential for both a stable economy and for individual freedom. And this, of course, is where the book's title finally enters the picture. The central thesis is that Bitcoin is a 21st century invention that digitally recreates the properties of hard money. It's built from the ground up to have provable scarcity. Its supply schedule is transparent, it's predictable, and it has a hard cap that can never be changed. In essence, the book argues it's an attempt to create digital gold. The author closes with this incredible quote from the economist F.A. Hayek. Now get this, speaking way back in 1984, before most people even knew what the internet was, Hayek was saying that he didn't think governments would ever willingly give up their control over money. He speculated that the only way we'd ever get back to a sound money system is if somebody, somewhere, invented something by some sly roundabout way that governments simply couldn't stop. And so that's where we're left. The book lays out this grand narrative of human history as a constant, multi-thousand-year search for harder and harder money. It frames the 20th century as a government-enforced detour into easy money. So the question it leaves us with is this. Was that detour the end of the story? Is the search over? Or are we right now witnessing the very beginning of the next chapter in that long search?